We're supposed to start with a story, right? So here's my story. Perhaps you've heard about Bill Miller. Bill was a farmer, and had all of the character qualities that you associate with the hard-working rural folk of the Midwest. Very impressive guy, raised 4 kids, loved his wife. And one day, Bill was out plowing the field, and this hard-working man of character had a heart attack and bought the farm. Well, as the story goes, he went up to the pearly gates, and as he approached these marble doors that were gold inlaid, there was a sign over the archway that said 1,000 points. So St. Peter came out to greet him and said, "Hi, Bill, great to have you here. Tell me what you've done, how you qualify to enter the kingdom of heaven." So Bill said, "Well, I have had a committed relationship with my wife. I've loved her selflessly for 50 years. We've had a tremendous marriage." Peter was very impressed. He looked at Bill and said, "That'll be 1 point." So Bill thought, Peter said, "What else?" So he thought, well, you know what? I've raised 4 great kids. They're all young men and women of character. They've been involved in their communities. And my wife and I have just been tremendously committed to them. Well, by now you could tell that Peter was really moved. And he said, 1 point. Now, Bill began to worry about this thing because he looked up at the deal here and realized he needed 1,000 and he's only got 2. So he thought, well, this will cinch it. "Peter, I believe in God. And I have been committed to my church. I've given abundantly to my church. And I went not as a hypocrite, but sincerely. And I've done this all my life." Well, at this point, Peter, he just commented, "Bill, I don't know that I've ever seen someone come before this gateway that had the qualifications you have." That'll be 1 point. So Bill looks at the 1,000, looks at his 3, and he says, "Peter, I don't know what to say. It's only by the grace of God I'm going to get in here." Peter said, "That'll be 997 points." I'm right on it. The whole issue of entrance into the kingdom of heaven is going to be the discussion today. And what I'd like to suggest here, that there's an aspect of Bill's theology that is absolutely biblical to the core in the New Testament, but in a slightly different way than my review will indicate that some of these other writers are stating it. What is the issue before us? Throughout the Gospels, Jesus makes numerous statements that can be very problematic. For example, he says in Matthew 5:20, "Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And interpreters have commonly look at this and understand the thing to mean, well, it seems like you've got to have some kind of ethical lifestyle if you're going to enter the kingdom. Because the righteousness in the Gospel of Matthew is not the imputed righteousness of Christ. It's the ethical righteousness that Jesus delineates in the sermon itself. So if we're going to take it in a straightforward way, Jesus does seem to be saying that if you're going to get into heaven or the kingdom, you've got to live out the Sermon on the Mount. Looks like works. Or you go to Matthew 7:21. Jesus says, it's only those who do the will of the Father will be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will get into the kingdom. Only those who do the will of the Father. Now, I'm aware that there's a very plausible explanation of that. It could mean that the will of the Father is to believe upon him whom he has sent. In fact, that's what I said in my book, but I've changed my views. I think that's permissible. I learned that yesterday. The will of the Father is to live out the Sermon on the Mount. That's the context of this thing. So it appears that we have another passage that's teaching that salvation is by works. Now, there's about 9 specific instances in the Gospels where works are associated with entering the kingdom. So that's the issue. How do we address this? Now, the essence of the argument of the writers that I'm going to comment on goes something like this. The major premise is that terms such as eternal life, saved, inheritance, or the phrase enter the kingdom all refer to personal salvation from sin. Minor premise is all these terms have conditions of works attached to them in many passages of the New Testament. The conclusion, then, is that works are necessary for personal salvation. Now, that's the essence of the argument that we're going to address here. Now, there's been 4 approaches to this problem of the apparent need for works in the Gospels as a requirement for entering the kingdom. The Arminian says faith alone saves, but faith plus God-produced works keeps one saved. Somewhat similar to the so-called new perspective on Paul that N.T. Wright and E.P. Sanders and others have been advocating. The experimental predestinarian, that's my term for the reform, faith alone saves, and the faith that saves is not alone. In other words, genuine faith will always produce a life of works. So, for example, when Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom, what Jesus is really saying, he's not presenting a condition of entrance, but a description of the character of the saved. Very common interpretation of this, for which I can see no basis or hint in the text. The partakers, the viewpoint that I've called the partakers, based on Hebrews 3:14, we are partakers or partners of Christ if we hold fast our assurance firm to the end. The thought here is that faith alone saves at the beginning and at the end, but choices made by the believer and enabled by God result in rewards. In the final category, I'm calling the neo-nomian. And I don't mean this in a pejorative way. Neo meaning new, nomian law. These are the new legalists. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I'm just trying to come up with some kind of label to generally describe this viewpoint. And essentially, it's the view that says faith alone saves at the beginning, but faith plus God-produced works saves at the end. In other words, in the final analysis, works are involved in our obtaining final entrance into heaven. Now, there's several distinctives that I want to highlight before I analyze in more detail what they believe and our response. First, in regard to works for salvation, it's very clever. They draw a distinction between pre-conversion works, which don't save, and post-conversion works, which do. You may be wondering how someone can believe that salvation is by works when Paul says, by grace you are saved through faith, apart from works, lest any man should boast. Aha! That refers to pre-conversion works for the non-believer. That person cannot be saved by works, but the believer can. And the post-conversion works of the saved man ultimately are necessary for him to obtain entrance into eternal life. When they talk about works being an evidence of salvation, it seems to me there's a little bit of double talk here. On one hand, if you're looking back, your works are supposed to be viewed as a demonstration, the classical Reformed view. True faith demonstrates itself in a life of works. But looking forward, works are to be viewed as a condition. So on the one hand, the believer is supposed to look at his works as a demonstration of a salvation already obtained. But on the other hand, he's supposed to view his works as a condition necessary to obtaining salvation. So there's a little bit of confusion here. The believer has to hold two opposite points of view in mind at the same time.